Hello, everyone, and welcome to a new episode of the Makdisi Street podcast. My name is Usama Makdisi, and I'm joined, as always, by my brothers Sadi and Karim. We're delighted today to welcome to the pod Laila Al-Arian. Leila is a broadcast journalist, a graduate of the Columbia School of Journalism, and she's now the executive producer of the Al Jazeera English documentary series called Fault Lines. She has co-authored Collateral Damage, America's War Against Iraqi Civilians with Chris Hedges. She has produced several documentaries, including the Peabody-winning investigative report Made in Bangladesh. Leila's most recent work as executive producer and writer is a truly haunting 2024 The Night Won't End, Biden's War on Gaza, which investigates the massacre of Palestinian civilians and children by Israel with US-made weaponry and tracks three harrowing stories, including the now infamous story of the Israeli killing of Hind Rajab, the 6-year-old girl who was trapped in a shot-up car and eventually was killed. She and her relatives, as well as the ambulance crew that was sent, the Palestinian Red Crescent ambulance crew that was sent to save her, who were also killed by the Israelis. It's an extraordinary story. Leila, thank you so very much for joining us today, and thank you for all that you do. So, Leila, welcome to Makdisi Street. It's really an honor to have you on with us today. And the first question that we always ask our guests is, who is Laila Al-Arian, and what made you become the journalist and and intellectual that you are?
Thank you so much for having me on. It's an honor. So I'm Palestinian American. My grandparents were Nakba survivors, mostly from Yafa, although I have a grandfather as well who was from Gaza and who actually died in Gaza in 2019. I was just remarking about this to someone the other day, which is in this really dark and sad way, people, Palestinians with family in Gaza, feel almost a sense of relief when your loved ones have already passed on and haven't been around to witness and survive this genocide. So the way that I ended up being born in the US is that my father came here actually for college when he was 17. He and my mom both mostly grew up in Egypt. And when Sadat came into power, he changed the laws so that Palestinians were restricted in what they could study. And my father, this is, I think, a story of so many Palestinians in the diaspora, so many refugees and descendants of refugees. He was very much limited in what he could study in Egypt, despite having worked so hard. And his father told him, apply to every university, in the UK, in the US, wherever you get in, I'll give you my life savings to pursue your education. And that's what he did. And my father ended up in Illinois. My siblings and I grew up in Florida, where he was a professor at the University of South Florida in computer engineering. And, growing up, I think like a lot of Palestinians, we always had the news on. My father consumed every news magazine, every newspaper. We always had, CNN on when CNN became a thing, or the nightly news even. And I just remember what the images that I saw on TV, especially of the first Intifada, did not reflect the reality on the ground for Palestinians. So, of course, the images were unforgettable. The children confronting the huge tanks with stones, but the framing, the language, the narrative, the way that the Western media was reporting on what was happening in Palestine was so contrary to what I knew was the reality. It was so devoid of context. And rather than informing people, it was actually making them more ignorant and more confused, and it was muddying the waters. So it was in that context that I knew the importance of journalism. I knew the importance of narrative, and I knew that things weren't going to change unless there were people with my perspective who became journalists who were able to kind of tell not just the Palestinian story. My career has really, spanned the second Iraq war. I interviewed 50 US Marines and soldiers who'd come back from Iraq about war crimes they'd either witnessed or participated in. So sort of coverage of the Middle East writ large, but also even here in the US of economic inequality, of the criminal justice system and all of the injustices, related to that.
So, Leila, so thank you for that. And you mentioned your father, and of course, we're going to talk mostly about you, of course, in this podcast since it's about you. But you are obviously influenced by the persecution the prosecution and persecution of your father, who was a professor, as you said, in Florida, which is where you grew up, correct? And then he was eventually imprisoned, then subject to house arrest, I think, in your house, and then eventually deported in 2015. Can you tell us a little bit more about, because that's sort of a bellwether for all the kinds of cases that we see today across the US. That must have had a huge impact on shaping you as well, correct?
Absolutely. Whenever anyone asks me about my father, my question is, how much time do you have? Because this is a case that went on for 12 years, if you could believe that. And that's just his case alone. That doesn't include the kind of both pro-Israel media campaign that preceded his case, as well as the arrest of my uncle Mazen, my mom's brother, that kind of was very much related to my father's case. So it's a very long and complicated case. But the short of it is that my father, as I mentioned, was a tenured professor at the University of South Florida. Pro-Israel kind of operatives like Stephen Emerson, who's a well-known kind of Islamophobic, anti-Palestinian operative who's been kind of targeting Palestinian activists for many years. Most notoriously, he tried to blame the Oklahoma City bombing on Palestinians, on Middle East, what he called Middle Eastern terrorists. Of course, he turned out to be wrong. But Stephen Emerson and one of his lackeys, who was a Tampa Bay Tribune, it was the kind of right-wing daily newspaper at the time, reporter named Michael Fechter had been going after my father for many years, trying to smear him as a terrorist. And then it wasn't until 9/11 that the government kind of had the environment of fear and hysteria in order to bring on a case. After 9/11, there was a Fox News show called The O'Reilly Factor, hosted by the notorious right-wing host Bill O'Reilly, that brought my father on. And he ended his show by saying, "Dr. Al-Arian, you're a terrorist. If I were the CIA, I would follow you everywhere you went." He kind of basically recycled Emerson and Michael Fechter's allegations and smears. And then the university, rather than protect my father and defend him as someone who, is being targeted for his speech and for his advocacy, ended up suspending him. And then it became this huge scandal, and it was sort of described by even mainstream newspapers like the Washington Post, like the New York Times, as a test case of academic freedom after 9/11. And then he was involved in litigation against the university. And just as he was about to come and to a settlement with the university and reach an agreement, he was indicted by the Bush administration for material support to a specially designated terrorist organization, which was the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, along with 3 other Palestinian American men. They were tried under a conspiracy case. The trial went on for 6 months. After the 6-month trial, the jury deliberated for 13 days, and they found him basically not guilty on the vast majority of counts. They fully acquitted 2 of the men, but for my father and one of the other men, they hung on some of the counts. So then, because he wasn't fully acquitted, the 2 jurors who didn't want to fully acquit him said, "We just had a feeling he was guilty." They happened to be the 2 that had read that right-wing newspaper that had been going after my father for so many years. But because he wasn't fully acquitted, the government had the opportunity to retry him. Very pro-Israel. He came to a plea agreement with the government that was supposed to end his case in 2006, but a very pro-Israel prosecutor here in the Eastern District of Virginia, Northern Virginia, where I live, named Gordon Kromberg, tried to retry the Florida case. It's very complicated, by bringing my father up to Virginia, trying to ensnare him in another investigation, in a classic perjury trap. Long story short, this went on from 2008 until 2015, when the Obama administration dropped the charge against that new case, against my father in the new case. It was one charge of, for not testifying before a grand jury, and he was eventually deported to Turkey, which agreed to accept him as a stateless Palestinian. So sorry for all those details, but as I mentioned, I mean, this is very much the abridged version of what happened. It was a 12-year case. He spent many years on house arrest, living with me and my family eventually. And the way this case shaped me is, of course, you learn the power of the government when it wants to build a case against you, all of the resources they have. I mean, in his trial, along with the three other Palestinian men. They flew in dozens of witnesses from Israel to testify about attacks that even the prosecutors conceded my father had nothing to do with. They took a Tampa city bus, drove it out to a field, and blew it up to recreate a bombing to show the jury so that they can kind of emotionally manipulate them. We were very lucky. I mean, this is a downright miracle that he was not convicted, because the US government in terrorism trials wins. I think they have about a 99% chance of winning a terrorism trial. In general, the government prosecutors have, I think, about a 98% chance of winning. But when you're talking about a terrorism case, that even goes up. So the fact that the jury could see through their emotional manipulation, and in the end, in interviews that the jurors gave with journalists and filmmakers, they said there was simply no evidence. These were men who were advocating on behalf of an occupied people, and the evidence that the government was presenting was all protected by the First Amendment. So books my father read, speeches he gave, magazines he published, they were literally entering books into evidence. At one point, in an especially comical moment, they entered a dream that one of his co-defendants had, who was describing to someone else.
It's sort of unreal, Leila. It really is unreal, and of course, the traumatic impact on you and just on your father, Professor Samuel Arian, as you said, who's now in Turkey. It's incredible to even think about this, and we're wondering. So, how do you relate? I mean, insofar as you can, the climate today that you see in America, how does it relate to that? Because there are professors who are being and journalists who are being sort of persecuted in this country now, not to the same extent, obviously, as what your father and what your family has gone through, at least thus far. But how do you relate these two? What would you tell people today in terms of, how to think about, and how to deal with the
At the
situation?
At the time that my father was being kind of persecuted and attacked by these pro-Israel forces, and then later on by the U.S. government, they were really framing it around, Islamic terrorism, the Islamic threat. It was the post-Cold War kind of need a new enemy. Bernard Lewis, Samuel Huntington. The clash of civilizations. This is the new enemy after the Soviet Union. So they were really pressing on these buttons to kind of frame Palestinian advocacy, Palestinian, the perspective as being kind of Islamist, extremist. And I think after 9/11, it was easier for them to make that case, in the sense of very early on, you saw an attempt by pro-Israel groups to conflate what happened on 9/11 to my father's advocacy. And there was kind of very little room for nuance in terms of the environment we were operating in, of fear, of hysteria, we saw, the way that the US went to war in Iraq and Afghanistan. And to actually be able to break it down and explain to people what is really happening to Palestinians was difficult. Although, as I mentioned, the jury themselves, who were regular people from Tampa, were able to see through the government's fear mongering and smears. But in terms of just dealing with the mainstream media, which very much participated in the onslaught, and even trying to kind of puncture through public opinion, that was challenging. Although I have to say, in Tampa, despite the years and years of smears against my father, he really did have a lot of support. And some of the biggest support came from actually like a progressive Christian community in Tampa that came out and would hold signs saying charity for orphans and widows is not a crime. And I think the jury seeing people that kind of look like them was really helpful. What's different now is, I think you have a situation where, unlike before, when I was growing up, it was the mainstream kind of Western corporate media that had a stranglehold over news, over what people saw on the ground in Palestine, over the way that narratives were shaped and framed. Now the media space is much larger. You have organizations like the one I work for, Al Jazeera, you have Al Jazeera English, you have AJ Plus, you have social media. So you have journalists on the ground in Gaza telling their stories and showing the most horrific images imaginable of the war, of the genocide, that people just simply cannot deny. So you have a shifting in public opinion, especially among young people who are accessing these images and can see what's happening for themselves. So you have a lot more willingness to question the media narrative, to question the government narrative. So even though the situation is very difficult now for professors who are being targeted for their advocacy on Palestine, or students or organizations like Canary Mission that are meant to blacklist people, I think part of the reason they're so desperate and they're attacking people so viciously is because they're so threatened by the changing of public opinion.
Leila, I was actually, you preempted me there. I was going to ask about the questions of solidarity. In other words, those that supported you, and just first in the case of your dad and the kind of the family, what kind of support groups you had. I mean, I'm not talking just about the family, but sort of the larger, in the larger the university itself, the other areas, and whether you see today. I mean, you just were describing that. Yes, the media landscape is a lot bigger, so people are, at least some people are exposed to different things. But in terms of the mainstream, in terms of the institutions themselves, do you see that having changed? Or, I mean, I am at a distance, unlike my brothers. I'm sort of at a more of a distance from the US, at least. It just appears that it's more choking when I see Florida itself, and I see how the universities in Florida, at least the public universities, are now being treated. The kinds of restrictions, the kind of pressure, this business of, at last I checked, they're looking into syllabi. So how do you see that change? Or is the solidarity and change in media landscape making it easier? Or is it both, maybe?
Yeah, I think it's both. I mean, Florida is definitely a scary example right now with the Governor DeSantis and some of the changes he's making and the repressions in terms of academic freedom, and specifically targeting Students for Justice in Palestine, targeting Palestine advocacy. I would say, my father did have tremendous support when the university first suspended him, and then, without any due process. And it was very much a case of academic freedom. So you saw the American Association of University Professors threaten to censure the university, which is a very big consequence, especially for a public university that depends on grants. And you saw editorials across the US condemning the suspension without due process of my father. Then, after his arrest, it became a lot more difficult to sustain that kind of support from these kind of bigger institutions because of the environment of fear. But the support that our family did receive from people, many of them actually weren't Arab or weren't Muslim, because the FBI locally in Tampa, where we were, was going actually door to door to families, asking them about my father, really trying to intimidate them and to make sure that we didn't receive support from the community. So the people that ended up showing support were the ones who felt like they had less to lose because they weren't kind of in the line of fire. But I think today we see young people, I mean, we saw with the encampments, who really can't deny what's in front of their faces because they expose themselves to actually what's happening in terms of on the ground in Gaza. When you see people, the older generation who only follow the mainstream media, you see a big difference in terms of their perceptions. So just to give you a sense, I was on a plane, a transatlantic airplane ride a couple of months ago, and the person next to me only read mainstream media like the Wall Street Journal. Every single thing he was telling me about his perception of what's happening in Gaza was completely shaped by the Wall Street Journal's coverage, and it was all symbolic of the monumental failure of the mainstream media in covering what's happening in Gaza, which is, on the one hand, a complete regurgitation of Israeli military and government propaganda, and a regurgitation of the official Israeli narrative, which we've seen time and again fall apart and essentially be built on a house of cards, on lies. And on the flip side, a complete denial of what we all see in front of our eyes. So saying things like Hamas uses human shields, Israel doesn't target civilians. It's not true that Israel has used, as many munitions as were used at the end of World War II in Hamburg, and Dresden and London combined. That's not true. So any fact you would present to him, he would deny. On the other hand, he was regurgitating pure propaganda. And this is one person who's a product of consuming strictly mainstream corporate Western media. Imagine all the other people who that's the only place that they're getting their information from. So you're dealing with a population that's not only ignorant, but completely manipulated. And that's why when you see certain polls that say Americans actually don't know who lost more lives, whether it was Palestinians or Israelis, when, tens of thousands of Palestinians have been killed, and the numbers don't even compare, it's because the media is failing in doing its job. It's keeping people ignorant, but also, on the other hand, engaging in manipulation and propaganda.
Leila, actually, on that point, the mainstream media, I mean, because you're absolutely right. Part of what we're witnessing these days is a growth in alternative media, social media, but then various platforms, including Jazeera and other, electronic intifada and other sites like that, to which young people in general turn, or people who are kind of already predisposed, or who recognize in a way the shortcomings of the mainstream media. But about the mainstream media, since you are also a professional journalist, so when it comes to things like, for example, we're all familiar with this. I mean, and you just pointed to some of them, like the headlines, for example, these days in Lebanon, Israel strikes Hezbollah targets. I mean, we don't know that's people's houses or people themselves or things like that, or and this is especially in the context of Gaza happening concurrently with the war in Ukraine. We've talked about this on this podcast before. The Ukraine headline will be Russia bombs Ukrainian hospital, whereas the one from Gaza will be, bombs fall on no refugees die as bombs fall in Gaza, like where they came from outer space. This. So my question is, when mainstream outlets do that, do they? It's like actually, I'd love to know what's going on in their heads. Like, what do they? Because you're saying that they're failing at what they're working at, and maybe actually they're succeeding in their minds on their terms. They're succeeding in regurgitating this view, but maybe not. I don't know. I've actually talked to many mainstream journalists. I actually think they're so deep in their world, in their echo chamber, that maybe they don't realize. I mean, it's so maybe it's so. I'm not giving them the benefit of the doubt. I'm just thinking, what's going on in their heads? Maybe they're so predetermined that they can't think outside those parameters. That's just how they think. But I don't know. I defer to you on this question.
There's a lot going on here. One thing is, let's not forget, who are the people running newsrooms? They often come from elite backgrounds. They've gone to elite universities. They're, Harvard and Yale educated. They're sort of the same class that's running our country, right? They're part of that elite, political media class that went to school together, kind of has similar thinking, especially on foreign policy. They simply don't break from the US official policy. It's very rare to see a journalist working in these prestigious, powerful newsrooms actually willing to question official US foreign policy. Almost always they regurgitate whatever it is, US officials say, and their reporting kind of starts and ends there. So you do have some, I would say, outward clear bias. So, for example, the New York Times, their style guidelines leaked to The Intercept a few months ago. And as part of their guidelines, which they ironically said were meant to ensure accuracy and nuance, say that you can't use terms like occupation, like refugee camp, like genocide, even Palestine, terms that you should be able to use are not banned, but very much discouraged from use. And again, the irony of them saying that this is to ensure accuracy and nuance. So you have kind of official style guides. You have the people running the newsrooms who very much think alongside of the people running the country. There are journalists in these mainstream media institutions that do want to do good journalism, that do want to report the story. And we've seen examples of that. So we've seen the New York Times Visual Investigations Unit do a really good investigation into Israel's use of 2,000-pound bombs. We've seen the Washington Post do an excellent deep dive into what happened to 6-year-old Hind Rajab in Gaza as she was pleading for her life with the Palestine Red Crescent Society and the medical workers that came to rescue her, and they too were targeted and killed. So we've seen some efforts within these mainstream media institutions trying to make a difference, trying to tell the story professionally. and trying to be fair. But unfortunately, in the grand scheme of things, when you see the role of these institutions in pushing out Israeli propaganda day in and day out, whether it's Hamas using Al Shifa Hospital as a command and control node, whether it's alleged mass rape on October 7th, which was proven to be an Israeli propaganda campaign and without any evidence, whether it's smearing UNRWA time and again and trying to imply that people who work for the United Nations are actually militants and fighters. Whatever the propaganda campaign du jour of Israel is, you have a willing and all too complicit, usually Western media organization, willing to kind of push it out there and put it front and center. So part of the issue is that you could have these kind of one-off, really good stories that are professional, that are well reported, showing what's happening to Palestinians. But when in the grand scheme of things, these organizations are putting Israeli propaganda front and center on the front page, wall-to-wall coverage, the kind of good professional work ends up getting drowned out, and what ends up enduring are these propagandistic pieces.
So, Leila, there's no doubt that obviously, as you said, there are some excellent journalists who do work in the mainstream, and of course there are people such as yourself. I mean, a professional journalist, a graduate of Columbia School of Journalism, who's done so much work. But as a Palestinian American journalist, so what I'm wondering about, or what we're wondering about, is the experience of working in these. I mean, you work with Al Jazeera, maybe it's a little different in that case, but your experience in interacting with other journalists in the mainstream, your colleagues, for example, in the mainstream, what's it like to be a Palestinian American journalist? Given the fact that I remember after October 7th, how many journalists got in touch with me, Palestinian or Muslim journalists, who were absolutely petrified. They felt there was an extraordinary campaign of intimidation. They felt, as I said, terrified. So how do you manage that? And what do you tell people?
I should say that part of the reason I don't work in mainstream media is because of my father's case. Essentially, I was blacklisted. It was very obvious. By the age of 25, I had co-written a book with journalist Chris Hedges about the Iraq War. It didn't matter. So I'm very grateful to Al Jazeera that they gave me an opportunity when I was basically blacklisted. But this was also a time when I remember hearing reports of a colleague who's Arab American who was applying to the New York Times. It was in the thick of the Iraq War, and we've known that there's decades-long anti-Palestinian bias in these media institutions, who was applying for a job at the New York Times and asked what her religion is. So, which is illegal. But, we know that there have been issues for years. And of course, since October 7th, the pressure has only gotten much, much worse. So there was a letter put together by a group of journalists in the United States urging media institutions to be professional, to do better, to make sure that everything is reported within context, to vet claims made by the Israeli military. People who are Palestinian, who support Palestinian rights, are not saying be biased. They're not saying have a pro-Palestine. They're just simply saying do your jobs. Be professional. Don't be propagandist. Report a story out. If the Israeli military tells you something, verify that it's true. Don't just regurgitate it. And many of those people who signed that letter, who work for these mainstream newsrooms, were actually told they were no longer allowed to cover Israel-Palestine because they signed that letter essentially saying, please be professional. So we're dealing in a really high pressure environment and a really stressful environment. What I've heard from journalists, especially Palestinian, but also Arab and Muslim, who work in these mainstream newsrooms, is that they feel that Palestinian lives are simply not equal to Israeli lives, that there's a huge, dehumanization that we've seen. Something that has been stuck in my mind for months is this interview that was in the New Yorker with the American negotiator, Aaron David Miller, who said, he was asked about Joe Biden, and he basically admitted, and this was stunning, that Joe Biden simply doesn't value Palestinian life like he does Israeli life. And I think this applies to people working in these mainstream media institutions. This is the quiet part out loud. I mean, this is where it begins and ends, which is simply not seeing Palestinian life as worthy or equal. We saw that when the Pulitzer Prizes gave a special citation this year, not to Palestinian journalists, as they'd done in the past with Ukrainian journalists by name or Afghan journalists by name. It said media workers working on, the Gaza-Israel war, however way they framed it. They couldn't get themselves to say the word Palestinian. And this is a time when more Palestinian journalists have been killed by Israel than any journalist killed in any conflict since the Committee to Protect Journalists has been keeping records in the 1990s. So it's an unprecedented number of journalists killed and targeted, Palestinian journalists killed and targeted in Gaza. But you see a complete lack of solidarity and support. Compare that with the way that the industry came together to defend Aaron Gershkovich, the Wall Street Journal reporter who was arrested and detained by Russia. I mean, you saw hashtags, you saw campaigns, you saw buttons, you saw them having these long segments, but their silence when it comes to the killing and targeting of their Palestinian colleagues has been resounding.
Quick follow up, Leila, just to underscore this point that you're making too, is that this devaluation of Palestinian life obviously goes beyond journalism. We have it in the academy too. All those universities that issued statements after October 7th, talking about the mourning is the loss of Israeli life, that then subsequently have had nothing to say about the loss of Palestinian life. But for me, I just think one of the most interesting things is that you've talked about it, the micro level, like the phrase books and the style guides and so forth, like things like I've talked with the LA Times, for example. I've talked to them many times about, they use the term Israeli Arab, which obviously obscures the Palestinian identity of the Palestinian citizens of that state, or the Israel Hamas war, things like that. They're so small, but they do so much damage, maybe because they're so small. So it's not just the big picture stuff that you're talking about in terms of perspectives, but also the micrological stuff there, where people's minds can get pre-programmed without them even being aware that that's what's happening.
That's exactly true. I mean, language is so powerful, and the role of language and framing people's perception of this is so key. These key phrases. I mean, Peter Beinart, who's someone who I think is really evolving on this, even in the last year. But I noted in an article he wrote for the New York Times not long after October 7th that anytime he mentioned the word violence, it was about Palestinian violence, never about Israeli violence. And then I actually wrote this on Twitter. What were the words that he used to describe Hamas? It was like murderous, barbaric, savage. All of these like very emotive words are used always to describe actions by Palestinians and never about Israelis. Well, I have seen murderous, barbaric, savage acts for 1 year. And let's just say for 78 years or however long it's been. But at least in the last year, we've seen, the most live streamed genocide in our lifetime in history. And you don't see these emotive words used about what's happening to Palestinians daily.
Leila, the question, you've been talking about the mainstream media. I wonder if you can just explain what that means, actually. Is Jazeera not mainstream media these days? In a sense that it's and just to quick thing, because a lot of people a lot of people say, well, Jazeera is a effectively state-owned media that basically follows Qatar's foreign policy, etc. Can you clarify what Jazeera? How is Jazeera different? And editorially, is there the kind of interference that happens in the mainstream media, Western mainstream media?
Al Jazeera, the Arabic channel, was founded in Qatar in 1996, and it was widely viewed at the time as kind of this breath of fresh air in a region that only had state-backed media, regime media, where there were many, many, many red lines about what could and could not be reported. And Al Jazeera English was established about 10 years later in Qatar, but also there was offices all over the world, in Washington, D.C., in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, and London, and all over. It has one of the most diverse newsrooms I've ever seen in the world. And it's, very popular channel in places like Pakistan and places like Nigeria, where there's really this appreciation of its global perspective and the fact that it covers the global South in a way that kind of corporate Western media no longer does, and definitely from a different perspective. I myself have not faced any editorial interference. I've worked for Al Jazeera English since 2008, and I feel very fortunate that in my work, in my experience, I haven't received any editorial interference at all. I can't obviously speak for everybody at the network or everybody at all of the channels. I mean, it's a huge place with offices all over the world, but I can speak for my own experience to say that unlike friends and colleagues who are in other newsrooms who face censorship every single day, especially on the Palestinian issue, because we know this is the one issue in the United States that you really cannot report freely on. And we know the tremendous pressure that comes with reporting on that story, which is frankly why a lot of journalists don't even like reporting on it. They just say, like, I don't want to be near that story within a 10-foot pole. But, I think I don't consider Al Jazeera mainstream media because what I consider mainstream media is to be kind of the big corporate or Western media institutions that essentially set the agenda for most of the world, and other media outlets kind of follow. It's not to say that they're setting the agenda for Al Jazeera. It's to say that they're in the global north, and traditionally they have set the agenda, and their kind of business models are corporate based, and their audiences turn to them as objective and reliable sources of information, but they're not at all transparent about what the red lines that they have are.
So Leila, on that point, working for Al Jazeera, for example, Karim just mentioned that there's always a little tag that says Jazeera is a state-funded, blah blah blah. They of course never say that with the corporate media. That the corporate media is owned by these corporations, or these corporations dominate, and so on. Again, to always sort of, it's like the Hamas-run Ministry of Health. It's the same kind of thing. They always put on these little things to sort of distract from and make sure that people get suspicious. But I'd like to shift, if you don't mind, to the extraordinary documentary that you produced fairly recently. I mean, the truly harrowing documentary, "The Night Won't End," which is, of course, it's three different stories that of three different Palestinian families and their experience of being sort of basically witnessing the massacre of family members. And the second story, I mean, all the three stories are truly like gut wrenching and traumatizing. But the second story is about Hind Rajab, and you go through, and you and your team, I think you wrote the documentary script. I think you go through the whole story of Hind Rajab, and it's just it makes one cry because it's so haunting. It's so outrageous. It's so like shattering, really. How do you see that kind of work that you're doing bringing to life? You're really humanizing, even in death of all these Palestinians. You're humanizing the experience. The mother, Hind Rajab's mother, who has to go. It's shattering for any parent. How do you see that kind of work breaking through this sort of mainstream media sort of dehumanization, dehistoricization of Palestinians and of Arabs and Muslims? Do you see it? Are you getting feedback for this kind of work?
Yeah, we've received tremendous feedback. It's being screened all over the world, which we're really gratified to hear that people are being moved. It was screened in Sydney. Some folks in Jordan are trying to screen it in Amman, and at universities all over the country, even virtual screenings that people are putting together. And I think the feedback we've gotten is that it's so unusual to see such an intimate portrayal of families in Gaza, because what we're used to seeing are kind of videos and videos and videos, like just a stream of videos or photos into our phones where we just see people at their absolute worst moments, and that's all we see, and then we just move on and we keep scrolling. And there's this danger of becoming desensitized or even numb to what it is we're seeing, because the scale is just so incomprehensible. So what we wanted to do is to kind of take a step back and say, okay, what we've observed in Gaza is that there's no place safe. Whether you're following Israeli military orders and going south to a so-called safe zone, or whether you're staying put in your home, or whether you're going from place to place to place, safety is elusive. It doesn't exist. And that's what all of these stories have in common, whether it's Hind Rajab in the car with her mother's uncle and his family, pleading for her life, or it's Abdullah al-Ghaf, who followed Israeli military orders to go south, went to Khan Yunis, and his family was attacked there anyway, or whether it's the Salim family, who within the span of 8 days survived and witnessed two of the most horrifying tragedies I've heard in my life. One was a massive bombing, which is not extraordinary. I mean, that's what people have to understand, is that a bombing that kills more than 100 people in Gaza is normal. That's the scale by which the Israeli military is killing people, 50 of whom were children in that attack. And then a week later, the Salim family witnesses an execution of 11 men, including the father and husband, Ayman Salim. And this execution, it was very important for us to cover it in a way that was thorough, in a way that was, we gathered all of the available evidence. We spoke with all of the survivors. And because we know that any journalism produced on Palestine, on Gaza, on war crimes is going to be scrutinized. And unlike the mainstream media, which has this very, patchy, let's just say, track record of publishing stories that end up falling apart, we wanted to make sure that it was completely airtight. And so we gathered all of the evidence of that execution that happened on December 19th in Gaza. And it's really important for people to see the humanity of Palestinians, to understand their losses, to feel their losses, and much credit goes to the photojournalists and that we worked with and the cameramen on the ground in Gaza that we worked with, who did this filming under the most extraordinarily difficult circumstances.
So do you feel, or do they feel betrayed by the extraordinary complicity of their fellow journalists? I mean, there are obviously good journalists. I mean, there's Chris Hedges, with whom you've worked. There are many good journalists who are actually trying to do the right thing. But just it seems like the Palestinian journalists, as well as Palestinian professors, as well as Palestinian healthcare workers, have been abandoned in essence. Not everybody, but how do you navigate the sense of again, anger, the feeling of outrage? How do they do it? I find it astonishing, because the film it's because the film, as you said, brings to light the humanity of these people and their stories. And it's unbearable, because the discourse in America is all about something else. It's never about them.
You can kind of see this evolution, not just with Palestinian journalists, but with the people in Gaza who are surviving and going through this genocide from the very beginning until now, where people are just exhausted. At the beginning, there was hope against hope. Well, if we tell our story, if we film, if we document, maybe people will care. Maybe their conscience will be shocked and they'll do something. A year into it, people are exhausted. They're like, why should I tell my story? Why should I show you my pain? Why should I talk about my loss? Some people still do it because they have faith, they have hope, and that's what keeps them going. For the Palestinian journalists, they have a moral duty. They have an obligation to tell the truth, to document. Even if it doesn't make a difference tomorrow, they want to document it for posterity. They want to document it for history. They want to make sure that people know what happened and to whom it happened. They want to make sure that there's eventually some measure of accountability. So they don't stop. This is their moral obligation. This is their duty. And this is why they do what they do. And it keeps them going under the most difficult circumstances, under starvation, under loss, under bombardment, under multiple displacement. They just keep going. But it's hard. I mean, we've worked on films where, we just released a film a couple of days ago called Starving Gaza, about Israel's war of starvation. And in the first couple of minutes of the film, you see this horrific scene of a baby 5 months old. They're trying to revive the baby who was born during the genocide, and the baby dies. And his parents, his mom, Noor, didn't want to keep talking to our crew after her baby died. She just said she was angry at everyone, angry at the crew, angry at the hospital, angry at the doctors, angry at the world. And who can blame her? That's the feeling of who can blame anybody for the feelings they feel?
Leila, in a way, it seems like part of what you're doing is you're making films for I don't want to say an audience that doesn't exist, because obviously the audience does exist, but you're also putting it, you're anticipating a bigger audience in the future, when people, I think, will look back at this moment and realize how badly misled they were by what passes for journalism in the mainstream Western press. So I think that's a really important part of what you're doing.
Thank you. I hope so. I think one of my nightmares and recurring fears is that people will move on from this moment, from this time. Obviously, this is unprecedented in terms of loss and death for the Palestinian people. It's the worst time, even I think by many measures exceeding the Nakba. So you're talking about the worst period in, 76, 77 years. But I do have this fear that people will forget, they'll move on. And I think the least we can do is to document, is to bear witness, is to make sure that these records are there and that they cannot be denied.
Yeah, that's clearly, that's very important. But I also think people's minds are changing, and that's evident what we said earlier in this conversation. People who don't rely on the mind forged manacles of the CNN and the New York Times are able to think with more clarity, and therefore that's part of the audience you're already engaging. I just want to come back to this idea that, the part of the importance of the work you're doing is not just to present stories that aren't otherwise being represented, but also to present a framing that otherwise also doesn't exist. I think it's again, to go back to what we were saying earlier, so much of the harm that's done is at the micro level of framing and sentence structure and grammar and syntax. And you're opening this whole other world that really just otherwise, by and large, with very, very few exceptions, basically doesn't exist in Western mainstream media.
That's true. I think the framing is so key. And I think just it's as simple as, starting off from a place in which Palestinians are human and, have their lives have value. And you'd be surprised at how simple that is, but also how much the journalism around us doesn't take that for granted. Ta-Nehisi Coates recently, in promoting his book, has been talking a lot about the absence of the Palestinian perspective and the absence of, I think, I'm someone who thinks like the politics of representation and having someone in the room doesn't automatically mean that you're going to have that translate into the coverage, because that's putting a lot of pressure on that individual person to actually advocate, and not everyone is willing to. But we know that having people in the room who are willing to advocate, who are willing to share their perspective, does make a difference. And I think that's one place of hope, and that newsrooms are more diverse than they used to be, and that people are trying to push back. It's very difficult, but they are trying their best. And I think pieces like The Night Won't End, like Starving Gaza, like the new film that Al Jazeera's investigative unit just put out today called Gaza, about war crimes. All of this material, Bisan Auda's work for AJ Plus, I think is also being seen by mainstream journalists in these newsrooms that we're talking about. They're watching it, they're consuming it, and hopefully, in some way, maybe being inspired.
I just want to add one last thing, which is, I mean, for what it's worth, I do think that everything you and others like you are doing in terms of documenting is incredibly important. Not just, as Sadi was saying, for eventually a kind of archive, so that it's not forgotten on the one hand. On the other hand, when I think a lot of people are going to one day look back and say, we don't, we didn't know that it is to the extent, we didn't believe it, we didn't think it possible. And so these things will be there as resources, incredibly important. The other thing I think is incredibly important is that I think you have a whole generation, a young kind of this new generation that's coming through now on college campuses and otherwise, who are coming of age with this, and their politics are being shaped. Some that were not political are being made political because of this, and those that are being more emboldened and have a cause, in a sense. You don't even have to be Palestinian, obviously, anybody in solidarity with this, and others who were trying to ignore can no longer ignore. So these kinds of things are incredibly important as resources now. So not just in the future and for archiving, but for now, and it's tremendously important. So I just personally want to thank you for all your work.
Yeah, and I want to echo what Karim just said, because of course it's as we said, it's not just archiving, because I mean, unlike any other genocide, as you pointed out, Leila, this one has been live streamed, and there is absolutely no excuse for anyone to say, "Oh, I didn't know," when in fact, the work, your work, and the work of many other journalists, especially the Palestinian journalists on the ground, who are and actually ordinary citizens on the ground, or citizens, people on the ground who are documenting this unfolding catastrophe, have produced everything there is that anyone with an ethical perspective should need, is there and is available. So I guess I would like to wrap by thanking you, Leila, again for all the work that you're doing, but also maybe you could end by just telling us what you would tell young Palestinian and Arab and Muslim, but also any other journalist who cares about, this question of justice. Would you encourage them to go into journalism? Because it's been one of the, I mean, since Edward Said wrote covering Islam and Orientalism, decades and decades ago, you know, there seems to have been a shift. There is a shift. There are many more people like you who are working in this field. Would you encourage them to do more such work, because it is hopefully changing perspectives? I don't think it's a coincidence that as the newsrooms get more diverse, or as there are more people like us, in a sense, in these spaces, there's a shift of perspective as well. So, what do you tell young people who are contemplating going into journalism?
I would definitely encourage them to pursue it. I mean, the pay can be low, the hours can be very long and unpredictable. Sometimes you deal with difficult personalities in the field, but it's really, really, really important in shaping narratives and offering perspectives that are underrepresented or not represented at all, and being able to tell a story truthfully and in a way that can move people as well. And I think you can't underestimate the power of the media in shaping narratives and shaping people's understandings of what's happening. And it can also be really enjoyable as well as a job. I mean, you're dealing with especially the stories that we do, very, very difficult subject matter and very heart wrenching. But I think you cannot underestimate the importance of media, and I hope that more and more people pursue it. Palestinians, Arabs, Muslims, people who are underrepresented.
Laila Al-Arian, thank you so much for your time. It's been an honor for us to have you on with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, guys. That was an incredible interview with Laila Al-Arian. What did you think? Karim, what do you think?
No, I think it's always incredibly difficult to hear about the kinds of stories that these kinds of reporters like Leila cover, and the documentaries that she's making. She and her colleagues, that they make these kinds of documentaries. It's incredibly difficult to be reminded of them, to see them, to people like Hind, and children like Hind who were killed by the Israelis, murdered, their families. The other stories that she was telling us about, it's just incredibly difficult. But on the other hand, we need to know about it. We need to remember them. We need to always keep them in our minds, no matter how difficult it is, because in the end, we can do all the analysis we want and all the political and geopolitical analysis. Ultimately, it's about people. It's about people being killed, about people being displaced, about people being terrorized, people being, all these different things. So I find that incredibly difficult, but at the same time, one feels very proud to have these kinds of journalists and such, these kinds of journalists, these kinds of people making documentaries, and very courageous people like Leila, who are in such opposition to a lot of really what I find incredibly cowardly, as you said, not all Western journalists, but a lot of the mainstream journalists who are either very cowardly or who may be better but submit to kind of production, to producers, to owners who will tell them what to say or not to say, and kind of accept it, including anchors, including correspondents, big ones, the famous ones who should have a little bit more clout in what they say and what they do, and who could show more solidarity with Palestinian journalists being killed and massacred every day. So it's this kind of mixture, really. Sadi, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, that's clearly part of what's going on. Is this presentation of an alternative set of narratives, and I think part of what, I mean, this came up also in this discussion, but also in the discussion with Jeremy Scahill a few months ago. the perniciousness of house style guides and so forth that the New York Times and all CNN, they all use these guides that just end up just in a simple phrase. The simple phrase of saying over and over and over again, for example, the Israel-Hamas war, or now the Israel-Hezbollah war. It's just like it's so small, but it does so much harm. Because as soon as a reader reads that, they're framed, like that is the frame with which they're going to approach everything. You don't need to bother you don't need to bother with the question of perspectives. The frame itself has already done the harm. It's so
Exactly.
pernicious. It's so vile. The way it's so
And
cowardly.
but
This. Yeah, go on. Go ahead.
no, Sadi, but as you're saying, but it's exactly at this level of even you call them micrological. Is that the term you used? I mean, I haven't heard that term
No,
before, so
just
I've learned a new
micro
word.
level. It's micro. It's tiny. It's grammar. It's word choice. Sentence structure, syntax. This is where I would say most of the harm is about Palestine
The
in
ideological
Western
harm.
mainstream journalism. Yeah, but the harm in general. It's like that. If there's any word I could abolish from the English language, it's the word terrorism, because it's the most, as we know, it's the most nebulous and badly used term in the history of the English language and any other language, for
But
that matter. But it's
we've been writing enough in the sort of in the public sphere, and we remember we're old enough to remember, in the old days when we'd write and they would say the occupied territories or the occupied West Bank, and then the journalists would come, the editors would come and say, can we change the word to disputed? These kinds of, like, these little words that they would change around and do these things. But the question that I'm still sort
But is
of,
this new? Is this new? I mean, is there a different? I mean, are we saying there's something new, that's something that's not been covered for decades now? What is new about it? Is it that there are now? I think what's new. Sorry, but I think I'm going to ask you that's what's new is that there are more journalists that are out there. There are people like Leila and others and Jeremy Scahill and
exactly,
all
that's what
this.
I was about to say. Yeah, and the
but
majority
also
report and
also
all these other
also
people who
social
are.
media and alternative platforms like Electronic Intifada and all this. But what's interesting is, in that sense, if what's new in that sense is that there are so many alternatives out there. What's interesting is that the mainstream media it's like an ostrich sticking its head in the sand. The more the world around it changes, the more deeply it digs into its own pernicious and outmoded ways of thinking and of representing. That's striking, because you would think, in the name of business, when the business climate changes, you would think the business therefore needs to catch up with the times. But the times have changed, and these media outlets are doing exactly what they've always done, like as though
How's
nothing
that
has
any
changed.
different? How's that any different to us? Honestly, I'm not even exaggerating, but I genuinely still cannot understand how, for example, the Democrats now, the kind of Harris bid for presidential bid, how they can shoot themselves in the foot with this war and the possibilities that might happen in Lebanon and Iran and the kind of larger regional war in this total support for the Israelis and whatever they want and covering up whatever they do, that shoots them in the foot. How is this any different? Like, it's
Because
difficult
they're
to
more
explain it.
accountable. Because they're more accountable. No, it's very easy to explain that they're more accountable. This is to donors and to the status
Who's they?
quo.
Whoa, who's they?
The
You mean the
Democratic
politicians?
Party elite, the Democratic Party establishment, the establishment of the party. They're far more accountable to their sort of their donors and to the status quo and to the
So the
structures
media
of
is the
power
same.
than they are to their base. Yeah, and the media is, but the difference is that the media, unlike the Democrat, unlike the media, there are people, as Leila Al Jazeera, there are the Majority Report, and there's all these other things you can follow on YouTube who have millions of viewers. So it's not like that the mainstream sort of stranglehold is still there. The question is the question still of alleged prestige that accrues to you by being with the mainstream media, and that bubble within the Washington D.C. sort of orbit. Do you see what I'm saying? That seems to me to be the bigger issue, that there seems to be this kind of, if you write for the New York Times, it's considered to be this extraordinary, prestigious thing that you do. And of course, the New York Times has been one of the most hostile, consistently hostile sort of venues, racist, hostile venues in terms of the coverage of this war. It's blatant, the racism in terms of how it's covered. Yet, as Leila was saying, and this is the problem, is that every now and then they'll put in a good investigative report. That's what happens. And that's how they cover themselves and say, oh, they're objective. Because every now and then the Washington Post or the New York Times will put in something half decent and say,
Yeah,
you see, we are
even
giving.
the Guardian has done things like that too. Yeah,
Yeah, and the
but
Guardian does that as well.
the flip side of this, of course, is not just the producers of these media, but also the consumers. So I have colleagues who tell me did you see the latest thing in the Times today? Meaning by which they mean the New York Times. It's like, I don't read the New York. Why would I read the New York Times? I go anywhere near the New York Times. So this thing that there's a kind of, people still think of it as the bastion, not just of, like, if I read the New York Times, it's to see how the New York Times, like, I'm interested in its distortions and so forth. I don't go to it as a source of actual information because I think that would be a foolish thing to do. But there are still people who turn to these media as the source of knowledge about what's happening in the world, which is, of course, catastrophic. It's like intellectual suicide if you turn to these outlets for actual information about what's going on in the world beyond one's borders.
Yeah, and if we had had a chance, we should have. Sorry, Karim. Go ahead.
No,
Karim.
just to make this connection, I think I said the New York Times is read by all the policymakers and the think tankers and the politicians and the
Yeah,
Congress.
which is why they're a gigantic echo chamber.
Yeah,
They all
it is
think
an
the
echo
same
chamber.
way.
But I want to make the connection, Sama, to what you were saying earlier, which is these people that are looking at this mainstream media and listening to it and the New York Times and all of this are the people that are running for government and in the Democratic Party and doing all of this. The ones that are looking at Jazeera, or at least the good parts of Jazeera and the documentaries and people like Leila and Jeremy Scahill and those kinds of reporters and documentary makers and filmmakers are the ones who are being shunned by the Democratic Party. We won't even talk about the Republicans. So they're now operating at parallel levels. So there's a generation and a set of people that are going for more independent journalism and documentaries. But these are the same ones who are being shunned on college campuses, being shunned by the Democratic Party, being attacked by Canary Wharf or whatever that stupid organization is called.
Canary Mission.
Canary Wharf. I like Canary Wharf.
Canary Wharf is nice, it's good, but Canary Mission and these kinds of fascist type places. So these are two parallel worlds. The question is, I mean, do they remain parallel, or is there we thought that what's her name, Ocasio
AOC.
would be the one who would, or that kind of person would be the one bridging these two layers. But as she becomes more powerful in the Democratic Party, she's slowly abandoning that other part, the activist part.
Yeah, but Karim, you're the
she's
one
trying
that
to
always
bridge. She's trying to bridge, and
Yeah.
it's not an easy thing, by the way.
Yeah, but you're the one who always told me, Karim, that the question ultimately for is, I mean, this is not a program about AOC, but in these things, is it better to have these kinds of people who deep down are sympathetic, or is it better to have sheer hostile racist people who don't like Biden, who don't give a damn about our humanity?
I agree.
So
if you go into the system, it's better to have someone like her than to have some from Florida or someplace like that. Yeah, totally.
Parallel universe. I mean, in a way, the reason why so many young people are abandoning and renouncing the Zionist cause in the U.S. is precisely because they don't read the New York Times. It's like these things go together. The explosion of alternative media and social media and other kinds of platforms, including Jazeera and other things too, by the way, is what helps explain this generational gap between the people who still cling to the New York Times as an actual source of actual information and the younger people whose minds have been changed because they no longer succumb to that outlet.
So in that sense, Sadi and Karim, in that sense, we can say this is the most obvious shift in terms of when Edward wrote covering Islam and the question of Palestine and Orientalism in the 1970s, late 70s. This is where the most obvious shift is taking place, that this explosion of alternative media, social media, many more people of our backgrounds and other backgrounds, it's a much more diverse sort of group of people who are now entering into these fields. And that inevitably, hopefully, will create some kind of change.
But
of course, on the other hand, yeah, they're excluded now. But, the question is, they're not going to be excluded in perpetuity, one hopes. That's
the struggle now.
Yeah, that's a struggle. But the point is that there are more people than there ever been before, and that's important. And so insofar as we want to give a kernel of, it's not that we're here to give hope as such, but it is an important sort of sociological observation to make that there are more people, I should say, of more diverse backgrounds entering in. There's a more diverse media landscape than there's ever been before in terms of alternative media. And Karim, you're right. It doesn't make an immediate change right now. But as Sadi is saying, there is a generational change taking place. So something is changing. What we should cover at one point in our podcast, maybe in a future episode, is something parallel to Leila's and the American mainstream media, is the Arabic media. ideally would do something on the Arabic media landscape, which is dominated overwhelmingly by Gulf states. But what does that mean and what are the implications? But that's for a future podcast. So thank you, Sadi and Karim, and it's great to see you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.